Today, what we are going to do is move again right into another set of our practical positions in these rook endgames. In our practical positions video one, we talked about how sometimes the outside pass pawn is not as effective as it seems, especially when the rook is behind the pawn. We'll review a little bit of those ideas in this video. About here is a position where the outside pass pawn was effective, um, and a position where with a simple knowledge of some tricks that black has at his disposal here, you can win these positions quite easily. Now in the game, white really has nothing to do at this point, so he made a waiting move, brought his rook to h8, and he's sitting on the position. Um, and even without that move, he wouldn't have been able to prevent black's next idea anyway. I push my pawn, and if anybody wants to take a moment to see what black's goal is, how I'm trying to change this position in order to win, I would recommend you do so now. Okay, let's say you've taken a second to try to solve black's winning idea, and we'll assume that everyone here is a genius, and so you guys were able to solve it. So after white continues to make one other waiting move, what black's threat was to try to create a second pass pawn. Now, which pass pawn does he want to create? If you saw practical sessions, practical rook endings one, then you'll know that the pawn that's going to change the position of the opponent's king is the c pawn here, the bishop pawn. Giving up this pawn in order to create a corner pawn, not only does it seem illogical, it just flat out is the wrong idea, because when you push this pawn, even if white's making not any useful move here, when you push this pawn, you're doing nothing to change the fact that white's king can wait in the corner. Um, Now, as we've mentioned before in these positions with outside pass pawns, if white were ever to stray his king off of the seventh rank, the rook would easily move off with tempi and queen. Pretty obvious idea. And if the rook ever had the opportunity to come behind the king, like let's say the king moved to the bishop file right away, now we have this famous rook ending trick I like to call the backdoor rook trick, where the rook comes behind the king, and after the pawn is captured, we win the rook. So the point of showing you those two simple ideas is just to execute the fact that this king is trapped in the corner. He has to stay on one of these two squares back and forth, or he will lose the endgame. So black's goal, I guess, simply put, would be to try to force the king out. Also, one of the things we talked about in our last practical sessions video was the fact that this king is not threatening really to come over here. If the king ever made the journey to try to help the pawn, you'll notice that the king has no place to hide from check. So white would simply need to wait for the king to make the journey all the way to that side of the board, and then start to give checks at the right time, and black would have no place to hide. So again, those are a quick review of some of the basic ideas we covered, so that you may maybe understand this position a little bit more fully. So black pushes this pawn, and the idea, as I said, is you probably understand more fully now from what I just explained, is to try to create a second pass pawn, a second weakness for white to deal with. And what's cool about this position is that, let's say, even if white had given a check and even come up here where it seems that these squares are not only guarded once, but they're guarded twice by the pawn, and if I'm to push, I'm giving away the pawn with check. What's cool about these positions is that even with all that double defense, black would still sacrifice this pawn, and white would still have nothing he would be able to do but to capture it. The cool thing about this position is that all black needs is a second pass pawn that can force this king out of the corner in order to win. Um, Obviously, white wouldn't be able to capture with the rook because we could simply slide over and queen, or even sacrifice the rook if we wanted to. Um, and taking with the pawn would lead to a position we're eventually going to get once that second pass pawn has been created. Uh, black has a very easy road to simply wait. This is probably the toughest defense he could do. Give a check, try to pin the pawn. We'll make some progress. Give another check. We'll push the pawn. He tries to create some controversy, but eventually, long story short, he's going to run into a position where his checks and his waiting moves mean nothing. And again, even a move like this, where the square seems to be double guarded for double the defense, makes no difference against the coming push of the pawn. Once this move is reached, these outside pass pawn positions are easily winning. Um, if the rook captures, once again, the basic idea of simply sliding over and queening will win the game easily. You know what happens if the king captures. We gain a tempo with check. And the obvious point is that the bishop pawn, unlike what the knight and the rook pawn can achieve, the bishop pawn forces the king out of the corner, because his only other option of staying in the corner would allow for the progress of the pawn to another queen. So let's back up again and let's look at that. The point of this position, and I'm going to show you now, that plan is so straightforward. And once you understand the idea that an outside pass pawn endgame here is winning, as long as you can force this king out of the corner, then recognizing that plan of sacrificing the a pawn to create a pass bishop pawn becomes much easier to find. If you were trying to evaluate this position and didn't understand that idea, you might try the long journey of the king, which would make no difference against the checks. Or you might even make the big mistake of trying to sacrifice the bishop pawn, which also would not do anything to force this king out of the corner, because the corner pawn does not achieve that. So again, when you're in these positions, having that technical knowledge of the fact that the bishop pawn is the one that will create problems for white, or for the person trying to defend here, not the knight and the rook pawn, is a very important thing to know. We're going to move directly onto a position that is a little more complicated, but applies some of the ideas we've seen in both of the last two videos. And I would recommend that even in just the beginning position here, that you take a moment to see if you can correctly evaluate what is going on in this position. 1 second while I set this up for you. And here we go. So white brings the king closer to the pawn. You're now looking at a position where you have the, let's say you're black and you've got your rook in the optimal defensive position based on what you now know about these practical rook endings. Your rook is behind the pawn, white's pawn is on the 7th rank, which means that if he had chosen to come the other way, you would have not have been worried, because as soon as he starts to get close to the pawn, our checks begin. He comes back over, we come back over, maybe he attacks the pawn again, and maybe we defend the pawn again. So in terms of recognizing that white is not really threatening to come over to this pawn, because of our checks behind the pawn and because his pawn is on the 7th rank, a very good point to realize. However, white is threatening something else very serious in this position. And so we're going to back up to the beginning position we had, get rid of those moves there, and ask you to correctly evaluate this. What would you do here if you were black? And I'm not going to tell you the result of what this endgame is right away, in case you are actually going to try to solve it. Um, but even without knowing what the result is with best play, there is a best move here for black that you should be able to find based on how well you can see the future position. So go ahead and take a second and tell me, see if you can figure out what black's best chance move is here. Okay, we're going to hope you did that, and come right back. And this endgame is actually a loss for black regardless. And we're going to talk about one of the main reason why, which is a very important technique, very important technical idea, very important winning technique that you should know, if you're the person playing white in these types of endgames with an outside pass pawn. But before we get to that, let's talk about what black's best drawing idea was. Um, his most direct and most accurate drawing idea was actually to try to get white to win both of these pawns for this one pawn. Now, why is that a nice idea to do that? What seems to give white a second pass pawn? Well, if you remember some of the ideas we reviewed earlier, what's funny about this endgame is that white has now won 2 pawns for the price of one. However, what do you notice about these 2 pawns versus this one pawn? It's not good enough. White can't really make progress here, because all these 2 pawns can be converted into is a knight pawn or a corner pawn. When those pawns advance, I'm not even going to try to give checks here and draw. I'm just going to show you that when white advances and the eventual trade is made, you can take with either the king or the pawn, and you're not threatening to make any progress. Because as we reviewed in practical sessions 1, this position does not leave white with any way to make progress, because with the pawn on the 7th rank, the king has no place to hide because of checks, and the knight and rook pawns do not force the king out of the corner. If we had a bishop pawn, we would be able to force the king out of the corner. But with a knight and a rook pawn, your inability to force the king out of the corner is going to lead to a draw in this endgame, despite the fact that you're up 2 pawns. Very, very important point to remember. And if you looked at this position from the beginning, um, I think we all understood that idea when I just showed you that position there, where you could actually see it, that the pawn couldn't force him out of the corner. But being able to accurately evaluate that here in a practical endgame where, maybe even time pressure is involved, um, being able to see the future and know that idea ahead of time is what makes grandmasters. Your ability to find a move like this, which seems to be a ridiculous idea, giving up your defense, um, could save the game because of your knowledge of that technical position, that this king would not be forced out of the corner without a bishop pawn. So I think a very, very important point to notice there. I love that idea that black is able to see the future that deep and not panic about the fact that these pawns are weaknesses. Now, with all that being said, I told you this was an endgame that was a win for white. Well, the idea here is for white to take advantage of the other weakness in black's position, something I foreshadowed all the way back in practical sessions 1, and that is that generally the best defense for black, if you're playing a position with equal pawns on the king side versus an outside pass pawn here, is not to advance the f pawn. The best defense, if you can, is to keep your pawns back and just wait. Wait with the rook, wait with the king. You don't want to create a second weakness. And this endgame is going to execute that idea. Even with black's best knowledge of attacking this f2 pawn and hoping for white to miss that idea of the draw that we've been talking about, this endgame, even with all that stuff, this endgame is a loss if white recognizes the other weakness in black's position, which is the fact that the king and pawn endgame is lost. This is where we really start to get advanced, and if hopefully you've gone through this whole series of videos, you're really starting to have a good understanding of rook endgames, because your ability to sacrifice this pawn and transpose into the king and pawn endgame shows some real discipline and real maturity, because you recognize that these overextended pawns are going to lead to weaknesses in the endgame. Even with black being aware of this famous stalemate idea, hiding the king, hoping for an obvious capture of the pawn, black will still be losing if white finds the waiting move, forcing the pawn to push. White captures, black captures. White moves the king and prepares the run of the pawn to kingdom come, and the game is over. Black can try to trade, or he can try to push first, but it really makes no difference. White's pawn will queen first, and probably will be the only pawn to queen if he does it the right way. So we kind of went through this fast, and I'm trying to do that to make you feel like you're getting the most out of this video, and we're being as efficient as possible. But the ideas are very straightforward now. Um, Black should always be aware of the future defensive ideas. It's kind of like being aware of any sort of Philidor draw or the rook on long side, king on short side. Any of those things that you can add to your technical database of knowledge in your head are going to help your practical game. That's the point, is that I believe that the best practical players, the ones that can really play these under time pressure, have very good technical knowledge of what positions draw and what positions don't. And so if you found a move like this in the game, chances are you might get your opponent to take this pawn and transpose into an endgame that he's not able to win, because of your knowledge that the corner pawn and the knight pawn don't make a difference. Now, the other thing to recognize, though, is that if you're trying to win this position, or even if you're trying to draw, and your opponent is aware of the weaknesses that have been created here, he might know that the king and pawn endgame is now a forced loss for you because of the fact that you've overextended these pawns. Um, Obviously, any defense like this is not going to help. Your best chance is the chance of hiding the king for a stalemate trick, because any defense of trying to make the pawn solid are never going to work when you've got such overextension. You will always reach a position where white now has opposition. Black is forced to give up a pawn. He's going to do so and try to hold the pawns as long as possible, but he's not going to be able to do it, and the game will eventually be a loss. So this concludes our second video for practical sessions number 2. And I believe you're really starting to get to a point where your knowledge of rook endings, your technical knowledge of rook endings, is going to start making you a very good practical rook ending player. And good points to recognize here. Hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck in your chess tournament future.